Welcome to Equip, Build, and Mature. It's a cool day here today, but as I like to do on Saturdays, I want to do an overview of one of the books of the Bible. And today we're looking at Paul's letter to Jesus' disciples in the city of Colossae. So, the first of the 5 questions we ask each document: who wrote the document? Paul had never been to the city of Colossae before he wrote this letter to Jesus' disciples that lived there. We see this in Colossians chapter 2, verse 1. So this explains the personal greetings that Paul included at the end of the letter. This is something that he usually did in the letters to congregations he had not yet visited, like Romans. Paul did not go from city to city declaring his apostolic authority. He tried to develop personal connections with the people that he hoped to teach and hoped to serve. The more personal tone at the end of this letter would have been very significant in creating a connection with Jesus' disciples who lived there at Colossae. One reason Paul wrote this letter was to call attention to the false teachers who had slipped in among Jesus' church at Colossae. What time in history did this take place? Paul wrote this letter to Jesus' covenant disciples at Colossae in probably somewhere around 60 or 61 AD. It was during his first time in prison in Rome when he wrote this letter, after he heard that they were struggling with a false teaching that distorted the teaching about the person and the work of Jesus. Epaphras, a leader of Jesus' church at Colossae, delivered this news about the struggle they were going through. Now, Epaphras had been immersed into covenant with Jesus during the 2 years that Paul preached at Ephesus and taught in the school of Tyrannus. Epaphras then went to Rome. He went to Rome to serve Paul while he was in prison. We see this in Philemon 1:23. And he went to Rome to tell Paul about these dangerous teachings that Jesus' disciples at Colossae were hearing. So, Paul sent this letter. Tychicus, accompanied by Onesimus, carried the letters to Philemon and to Jesus' church at Ephesus. We see this in Colossians chapter 4, verse 7, and Philemon chapter 1, verses 10 to 12. Tychicus was a fellow worker of Paul. He would have been able to help Jesus' disciples at Colossae to understand and apply the teachings in Paul's letter. So why is this letter to Jesus' disciples at Colossae, why is it so important? Well, the disciples in Jesus' church at Colossae were under attack from false teachers. These false teachers were criticizing the deity of Jesus. They taught that Jesus was not actually God. Now, Paul had never met those disciples face to face, so he dealt with the issues quite directly. The nature of Jesus as creator and redeemer was essential to salvation. That is why Paul wrote to them. He needed to share his wisdom and his insight about that very difficult and trying situation. It was important for Paul that those disciples of Jesus should know God in all of his greatness and in all of his glory. The false teachers were giving them a defective teaching about the nature of God. We see this in Colossians chapter 1, verse 25, and Colossians chapter 2, verses 1 through 2. So what is the main emphasis or the big idea of this letter to the Colossians? Well, in this letter, the Apostle Paul described Jesus with great respect. He used some very powerful metaphors. He focused on Jesus' superiority. He taught that Jesus was sufficient in all things. Paul presented Jesus as the very center of the universe. He taught that Jesus was the active creator and was created when he came as a man. Jesus was and continues to be the visible image of the invisible God. Jesus contained within himself the fullness of deity, Colossians chapter 2, verse 9. And because of his divine nature, Jesus is sovereign. Jesus is above all things, with an authority the Father gave him. This is why Jesus is the only head over his church. He has reconciled all things to himself through his death on the cross. He made covenant disciples alive to God. At their second birth, Jesus' disciples started on the path to right living. See, this correct view of Jesus was the antidote for the false teaching among Jesus' disciples at Colossae. But it was also a building block for how to live and for what to teach in a way that pleased God both then and today in the 21st century. So how does this letter apply to us today in the 21st century? Well, our view of Jesus will impact every area of our lives. Many today want only practical teaching and helps for living. They want to avoid difficult issues like doctrine and theology because they seem to be out of touch with their day-to-day realities. Paul's view was very different. He saw that the problems of understanding Jesus among the disciples at Colossae also had extremely practical importance. Covenant disciples have died with Jesus. So we need to die to our sins. We need to die to the desires, the sinful, selfish desires of our flesh. We've also been raised with Jesus. So we must learn how to live well in him and put into our souls and into our minds and into our attitudes, put on qualities that are motivated by our love for Jesus. And since Jesus is Lord over all, the life of his disciple is to be a life of submission, total submission to him. Are you following Jesus as you should? See, our faith in Jesus should transform the relationships we have in every area of our lives, in our homes, with our fellow disciples, in our spheres of influence, where we're employed. Throughout the world, Jesus's impact should be strongly felt, strongly seen in who we are, in our behavior, and in our beliefs. Thank you guys for taking a few moments with me here today. Hope you have a great Saturday, and may God continue to bless us as we put Jesus in the right place with the proper perspective. Take care, guys.